Hello, everyone. I just wanted to let you know we're just going to wait a couple more minutes to give more people time to register, and then we'll be getting started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to make sure that Laura Ellen has enough time. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. No one can speak is what Laura Ellen is telling me because you're all on mute. Okay. Welcome to the monthly NASW Pennsylvania chapter webinar. This free webinar is a series that's done as a member benefit and is available to members only. Webinars are done each month on the last Wednesday of the month at 12 p.m. and count for 1 CE credit. To obtain your CE credit, you must attend a minimum of 50 minutes of this webinar. After the webinar, if you attended that minimum 50 minutes, you'll receive an email with a link to complete the evaluation. The link will also be posted to the chat section near the close of the webinar. The certificate will be sent to you by one of our staff members. Please allow at least a week before you contact us to say that you haven't received your certificate. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Laura Ellen Ashcraft is a second-year PhD student in the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. Laura Ellen received her master's in social work from the University of Pittsburgh with concentrations in community organizing and social administration. She has spent the past 5 years analyzing systems in the fields of mental health, housing, homelessness, and child welfare. She is currently the chair of NASW-PA's Political Action for Candidate Election Committee, known as PACE, And she also did a great job on Monday at our LEAD event at the Harrisburg Capitol. Thank you, Laura Ellen, for being willing to come and speak with us today. I'm now going to turn it over to you to start the webinar.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for the opportunity to speak with everyone. And yeah, let's get started. So as you know, today's webinar is entitled Policy Practice Isn't Just for Macro Social Workers, the Role of Direct Practice in Legislative Advocacy. And so just for your own benefit, this is the description that went along with this webinar. And so we often think that legislative advocacy is just for macro social workers, of which I am one. However, this really isn't the case. So today's presentation and our hopeful discussion together will describe the critical role that direct practice social workers, as an example, clinicians, have in legislative advocacy. So we'll discuss strategies for influencing policy and practical ways to participate in advocacy efforts. And so I'm really excited to get this conversation going. Okay, so our agenda for today, I'll start with a brief introduction, then we'll discuss the legislative process, which I think is really critical to understanding how we can then influence social policy. We'll talk about influencing social policy in and of itself, and then we'll talk about 5 steps to get involved. And then after each of these sections, I will allow a couple minutes for questions, and so you can please enter your questions into the little questions box, and I'll be sure to answer those as well. So let's start with a brief introduction. I have been a macro social worker since my undergraduate degree, and so really thinking about what are some of the systems level issues, and then how can we as social workers use our skills and abilities to address those issues. So as was already said, I got my Bachelor's of Arts in Social Work from Millersville, my MSW from Pitt, which is where I am now. I spent a short period of time as a consultant, and then worked in critical care medicine in research for a couple years before coming back to school. My current focus in my PhD program is access to evidence-based chronic pain management in primary care settings. But then also, and this is the most related to what we're going to be talking about today, disseminating research evidence to state legislative policymakers. So that's kind of where the policy connection is. As was already mentioned, I am the proud and happy chair of the NASW-PA committee, which I'll talk about a little bit later and can answer any questions about that. All right, well, why don't we get started? Let's talk about the legislative process. Let's go back to our middle school days of being in middle school civics. So here we go. So when we look at the government, and so this is looking at the federal government, but this is true in all levels of government, so thinking about local, state, and then at the federal level, the government in the United States is separated into 3 branches. And so we have this separation of powers that exists. And so that means that we have 3 institutions that we can think about that help to make, create, and modify policy. And this is something that's really important that I really want to drive home. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this, just because, again, as I mentioned previously, understanding the system that we're approaching can really help us to find the best way to advocate. Okay, so let's start with the judicial branch. So the judicial branch in the government is the court system. And so we have local, regional, state, and then national or federal courts. And so the judicial branch really helps to interpret the law as it relates to specific cases. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the U.S. Supreme Court, right? So they interpret the law as it relates to cases that are brought before them. Next, we move to the executive branch, and so this branch is headed by either the president at the federal level or the governor at the state level. And so policy in this branch, often we hear about it talked about as executive policy or administrative policy. And so this branch, the executive branch, really carries out the laws. And so sometimes we hear about executive orders. They can be a big thing, both at the federal and at the state level. So these occur within the executive branch and are made by either the president or the governor. Next, we'll move to the legislative branch, and this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time together today. So the legislative branch often includes the House of Representatives and the Senate. It varies in some states, but most states have the Senate and House of Representatives. That's what we have here in Pennsylvania. And so these are made up of officials who are elected. So at different levels of government and in different places, they have different terms. But in Pennsylvania, the Senate is every 6 years, and the House of Representatives is every 2 years. I'm sorry, I think it's 4 years and 2 years. When we look at the federal level, Congress, when we talk about Congress, we're talking about the federal level of government. And these are the folks that we typically think of as making the law, both at the federal and at the state level. So these three branches of government, even though they're separate, they all have a unique role, and they often work together to develop, implement, and interpret policy. All right. Whew, we made it. Next, we're going to talk about the legislative process. Again, that's what the majority of our conversation today will focus on. And so when we think about the legislative branch of government, this is the branch that creates, edits, and passes pieces of legislation. So this is the legislative cycle, and I'm going to walk through it briefly, but bear with me. Again, I think this is really important. I don't know how many of you remember the Schoolhouse Rock video, I'm Just a Bill. I remember watching that, in elementary and middle school. And while it's all fun and games, like I do think that's a really helpful, video in helping just to kind of summarize this process. So I'd encourage you to watch that later if you need a refresher. So the legislative process starts with an idea. Anyone can think of an idea. So a lobbyist can think of an idea, a practitioner, you can think of an idea, or a legislator can think of an idea. And so that idea is written down into a form that's a bill. So that can be either a brand new idea, or it can be a bill that changes current law. So what happens next is this bill is introduced in either the House or the Senate. And when it's introduced, it is then referred to a committee that relates to the topic area of that bill. So for a lot of things that we talk about here in social work, it may be human services or health and human services, depending on what chamber it's in. And when I talk about chambers, I mean the House or the Senate. So the bill is introduced and it's referred to a committee. Then in that committee, there will be hearings, debates, and discussions about the bill. Then the committee can vote on the bill. And so if the bill passes the vote in the committee, it will move back out to the floor of either the House or the Senate, depending, what chamber that bill was in. In the House or the Senate, once the bill has moved out of committee and is on the floor, there will be more debate and more discussion about that bill. So then the bill will be brought up for a vote in the House or the Senate, and then if it passes the vote, it will then go to the other chamber. So as an example, if the bill is in the House, it passes in the House, it will then go over to the Senate and begin that process all over again. So it will then go to a Senate committee, be passed out of the Senate committee, go out to the floor, be passed out of the floor. Once it has been passed in both the House and the Senate, it will then go to the executive branch. So that's the governor or the president. The governor or president will either sign or veto the bill. And then if it's signed, it then becomes law. So that's the process of how an idea goes from an idea to a law. Okay, so that may sound really simple, but unfortunately or fortunately for us, partisan control makes a huge difference in the way that laws are made in the United States. So if there is a majority in the House or in the Senate, that can make or break this legislative process. And so what that requires is for the majority party, so whether that's Democrats or Republicans, for their leadership to call that bill up for a vote. And we're going to talk about what that can look like in a little bit. But what I really want to drive home with you, and the key of this, is really to say, if the majority party in the House or the Senate decides that they don't want to vote on a bill, or if that piece of legislation is not moving, they don't have to vote on it. So I just want you to think about how much power they have. So let's talk about House and Senate committees, because this is really where the power lies when we think about legislation. So I'm sure you've heard that saying that talks about a piece of legislation dying in committee. So that's what this refers to. So again, if you'll remember back to our process, a piece of legislation is introduced and then it's referred to a committee. The chair of that committee is the top leadership in for the majority party. They can decide that they don't want to vote on the bill. They can decide that this issue isn't important, or they can use it for leverage, and then they can just not call for a vote on that bill. And they don't have to. There's nothing that says they have to. And so when this happens throughout an entire legislative session, which is, you know, the cycle of the legislative process, that's when a bill dies. So a bill never makes it out of committee because the leadership has decided that they're not going to call a vote on that bill. All right. So really understanding the legislative process will really make or break your attempts at legislative advocacy. So your brain may be spinning and you may be thinking, I don't really want to learn about this. I just want to keep doing my practice. I want to work with my consumers, and this just seems really complicated. I would encourage you to just take a couple breaths and give it some time. This is a really complex process, and there are a lot of intricacies here, but understanding the legislative process really holds the key in understanding how to target your advocacy to really make the biggest difference. And so there's a lot of little steps here, but when we understand the system, we can then navigate that system to make change. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. And so if you have any questions here, we have a couple minutes. I don't currently see any questions. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes here. If you have some questions about the legislative process, feel free to ask them.
Laura, Ellen, how long does the legislative process typically take?
That's a really great question. It really depends, and I think that could be a whole other webinar that we could certainly have that conversation. But I think sometimes if it's a piece of legislation that is really important to a lot of people, especially if there is bipartisan support, it can move through this process quite quickly. So in a matter of days, typically, it can't get through the whole process in less than a day, but in a matter of a couple of days, you could really get through this process. Other times, it can really take years. So the licensure bill that Pennsylvania passed last session, last year, it took us 10 years. So 10 times of starting from the very beginning, having the bill introduced, having it moved into committee to really get through that process and to have the governor sign the bill. So it really varies, like depending on how leadership perceives the importance of that piece of legislation, or the non-importance, or if they don't agree with the piece of legislation. Yeah, that's a great question.
Ronald has a question, asks, please tell us how we can influence them at the committee level.
That's a great question, and that is what I'm going to talk about next. So yes, so I think that's a great transition. Why don't we move on?
One more question about the legislative. So Bonnie asks, if the bill dies in a legislative session, does it have to be reintroduced in a subsequent session in order to be considered?
Yes. So I think that's a great question, and something that I should have highlighted a little better. Yes. So if a bill dies during that legislative session and either dies in committee or only passes one house, dies anywhere in that process. So if by the end of the legislative session it does not make it to the governor to be signed, it has to start all over again, and none of that previous progress counts for anything. So yeah, it's a little depressing, But yeah, we're going to talk about how to make a difference and how to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And then one more question that Bonnie had: how effective is it to advocate for a proposed bill between sessions, making changes or getting additional sponsors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it probably depends on if there's an election happening and if there are, you know, a significant number of new folks coming in. Often what can happen, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, is that when so when the House of Representatives or the Senate isn't in session, and between legislative sessions, elected officials tend to be in their district, and that can be a really great time to do the advocacy work and to do a lot of the legwork to kind of get folks prepared. So I think that, you know, it's a great time. At the same time, as soon as a session starts, things may come up that may prevent you from, you know, really utilizing that momentum. So just as a brief example, you know, here in Pennsylvania, we kind of historically have had a lot of budget battles and debates and issues with really, you know, getting a budget passed. And so as soon as budget season comes around, nothing else is happening and nothing else is moving because they're all focused on the budget. So even if you've made great strides in doing a lot of groundwork and meeting with folks between legislative sessions, if budget season comes around, they're, you know, unfortunately, they're just not looking at anything else other than the budget. Okay, so why don't we keep moving? And I've built in some time for questions, and so we'll go from there. Okay, so I think this is getting back to a question. So how do we make a difference? What is our role here? So let's first just take a step back and let's think about what is advocacy. So for the purposes of our conversation today, and I think certainly we could have a debate about, you know, if this is really advocacy or not, but advocacy is the active promotion of a cause or a principle. So advocacy involves actions that lead to a selected goal. It's one of many strategies or ways to approach a problem. So advocacy can be part of a community initiative, or it can be nested within a lot of different things. For our purposes today, advocacy is not considered direct service. So working directly with you know, a consumer to, you know, what I'm not talking about is working with a consumer and then, you know, advocating on behalf of that consumer with their landlord. That's not what I'm talking about here. And a lot of times, you know, I have a picture of a rally here. A lot of times we think about advocacy involving confrontation or conflict, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So that's what I'm talking about when we talk about advocacy. Also thinking about the definitions and kind of thinking about advocacy versus lobbying. First, just a disclaimer here, I am not an attorney, and so this gets into some legal stuff. And so if you have questions about advocacy and lobbying that you want to talk with, you know, and do on behalf of your organization, I would reach out to your organization's legal counsel to make sure that you're doing lobbying as part of you know, what is appropriate for your organization and that you're complying with all laws. So again, when we think about advocacy, we just talked about this, so speaking up for what you believe in. So what I like to think about when it comes to legislative advocacy is educating someone, typically an elected official, on an issue or a topic. When we think about lobbying is an attempt to influence a piece of legislation, so a bill. So saying to your elected official, on this bill, you need to vote yes, or you need to vote no. That is direct lobbying. And so where this kind of gets a little tricky, and again, I would encourage you to reach out to your organization's legal counsel if you really want to do this, is there's a certain amount of lobbying that is permitted for nonprofits, and it can affect your nonprofit status. And so lobbying comes out of the tax code from the IRS, and so that's why I would encourage you to speak with your legal counsel and to, you know, not take it from me. Okay, so We also, and I'm not going to go through this and read it to you. Y'all can read and you can look up the NASW Code of Ethics. But what I want to point out here is that our Code of Ethics, what defines us as a profession, calls us to participate in political engagement and advocacy. Involvement in these issues is not optional for social workers. And I think that's something, if you get anything from today, I really want you to get that this isn't an optional thing. And I know this seems like a lot, and this is like, oh my goodness, I'm already overwhelmed with all these different things, in my day-to-day work. I think it's attainable. I do. I think that there are strategies, and that's what we're going to talk about. I think there are strategies that all social workers in all fields can really participate in this type of advocacy. Again, I'm not going to harp on this too much, but I do want to emphasize that I think legislative advocacy and policy advocacy is not optional for social workers. Okay, so one more kind of like big picture thing before we get into the nitty gritty. I'm sure if you can all remember back to your social work education, you can remember this idea of person and environment, which comes from the ecological framework. And I think from my perspective, I think the ecological framework really helps me in thinking about how to effectively make advocacy efforts. And so this is one of the first things we learn in social work education, and it's foundational to how we practice in all areas of our lives as social workers. And I think it's true for your interactions with your consumers, but I also think that this is helpful for legislative advocacy. So as we learn about the process and the structure of the legislative process, we can learn how to navigate the system by thinking through this lens of person and environment. So it's important to consider that elected officials don't only exist within the legislative process, like they just don't spend all day thinking about that cycle that we talked about earlier, but they also exist within their parties. So what are their, what are the Democratic Party goals and initiatives? Same with Republicans, what are their goals and initiatives? And they also exist within their districts, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Elected officials have to consider the consequences of their actions for their party and for their district. And I think the ecological framework is a helpful reminder of this. Okay, so one of my friends, John Sawyer, shared these 10 rules with me several years ago, and I've been using them over and over. I want to, give all of the acknowledgement to him. I don't think I could have come up with a better 10 rules myself, and so that's why I continue to use them. So here we go. So understand a legislator's motivations. This is our first kind of rule. And this may seem like a pretty cynical perspective, but to a degree it is. Elected officials ultimately care about one thing, or three things actually: votes, money, and power. And so for votes, elected officials have to think about getting reelected, right? And so in Pennsylvania, every member of the House of Representatives faces reelection every 2 years. That is really often. And so this means that they have to think about how their current behavior is going to affect their abilities, or what they perceive as their abilities to get reelected. Money. I know, we don't like to talk about this, I think, stereotypically as social workers, but money and campaign contributions are a big deal. So Pennsylvania has no limits to state level campaign contributions, and people talk a lot about campaign finance reform, and this is part of what they're talking about. So money and the ability to fundraise is a reality and is a method and a mechanism of survival in state level politics. So elected officials have to think about how their behavior and the decisions that they make will affect their ability to fundraise, which then connects to their ability to be reelected. And finally, power. For elected officials, getting on important committees and leadership positions, such as committee chairs, are a big deal. And so this is both critical for fundraising, money, and electability, votes. All three of these are connected. And so elected officials do what they can to gain position and power and rise within their political party. So votes, money, power, it's cynical, but I think we really have to understand what are the legislators' motivations. Number 2, go to them and have them come to you. So this seems pretty self-explanatory, but I think it holds an important key. Go to your elected official. Don't be afraid of them. They're just humans, right? go to the Capitol like we did on Monday for LEAD, and go to their district offices. You are their constituent. You have every right to meet with them, and they want to meet with you. Call their office, use Google, find their phone number, and set up a meeting. It is as easy as that. And then invite an elected official, specifically your elected official, to come to your agency, set up a tour, have them meet some of the people that you serve. Not only is this a great photo opportunity, and I want to emphasize here, only do this if this is appropriate. There are certainly some practice settings where this is not appropriate, and you want to make sure that you're giving the people that you serve autonomy to say, no, I don't want to do this. But it gives this, and even just a tour, really gives an elected official a firsthand perspective and knowledge of the critical work that you do. They're in Harrisburg, at the state level, they're in Harrisburg a lot. They're sitting in their offices. They don't necessarily know all the work that you do day in and day out. And then talk with them about a piece of legislation or a topic that you want to fight for. They have a personal connection, and that personal connection is you. You are the expert, and that's something else I really want to emphasize here. You, as a practicing social worker, are an expert on these topics. All right, so know who you're talking to. So if you're, talking about a specific piece of legislation, know where this piece of legislation is located. Is it in the House? Is it in the Senate? Is it in a committee? And so if you're talking, you really want to think about where this is. So when we think about LEAD, which we just had, we were advocating for a piece of legislation, and it was in the House Education Committee. So let's just use that as an example. So if you're meeting with your state senator, they don't have direct influence on the passage of this bill because this bill is in the House Education Committee. Remember what we talked about earlier with the influence and the power that committees have, especially when a piece of legislation is sitting in committee. If you're talking with a state representative, but they aren't on the education committee, again, they can't really do anything until the piece of legislation comes out of the education committee or whatever other committee that it's in. What is important is to educate your elected official about the importance of the legislation. This is getting back to that advocacy idea. You really want to educate people. Again, you are the expert. Also, if your elected official is in a leadership position, so if they are the majority or minority leader for the House or the Senate, or if they're chair of the committee that the piece of legislation is in, they have all the power. So ask them to use their influence to move that bill forward. Okay, number 4, organize and represent others. Social work is good at many, many things. We all know this, that's why we're here, right? But one thing in particular that I think social work is super good at is organizing and motivating people. Legislative advocacy is an excellent place to use these skills. So find a topic or a piece of legislation that you care about, find other people with common interests, and work together to make a plan, and we'll talk about that plan a little bit later. And then implement that plan. You have the skills to bring a diverse group of people together and make a difference. We know this, we're social workers. This is one of our skill sets. Number 5, use numbers and stories together. Again, you can tell how excited I am about this, but I think this is one of the biggest advantages that social workers have, especially clinical social workers. And I think this is an advantage that we have over other professions. And this is the advantage. You know the stories of the people that you work with. You see what their daily struggles are. You know what can help them. And so you have seen these, you experience these, use that information. So maybe for an example, you can talk about how 50% of the people at the clinic where you work experience depression. And that is why it's important to have adequate resources for mental health services. You can talk about that. Use the numbers and the stories. You can talk about how depression for one of your consumers really influences their ability to care for their children or care for their parents, or whatever that looks like. You see this every day. Use those experiences to make a difference. Okay, make the ask. Number 6, we are timid to ask for something that we want. I know that I am hesitant often to ask for what I want. We need to be brave, and we need to make the ask in legislative advocacy. especially when we're thinking about lobbying. So when you're meeting with an elected official, ask if you can count on their support in supporting a piece of legislation, and then ask if you can get their response on the record. This is key. You want to be able to use the elected official's name in continuing to advocate for that piece of legislation. So if you're meeting with your state senator and there's a piece of legislation in the Senate and you say, Senator so-and-so, can I count on your support for this piece of legislation? And they say, why, yes, of course, you have made such a convincing argument. You then say, may I get this on the record? And then and they say yes, and then you say, and then after you're meeting with them, you can post it on social media. You can write it in, an op-ed or whatever else, other ways you do, and you can say that Senator so-and-so is supportive of this piece of legislation. Number 7, staff, staff, staff. I cannot overemphasize this enough. I feel like I'm saying that with most of these, but I really mean it with this one. When you schedule a meeting with your elected official, either in their district office or in their capital office, you may be disappointed that you're only meeting with a staff member from your representative or senator. Do not be disappointed. Staff are so key to this process, and they're a critical role. They have a critical role for our success. And so you will have more time to make your case, to have this conversation with a staff member than you ever would with an elected official. If you can convince a staffer that this issue, this topic, this piece of legislation is important, you have a way better chance of success with the representative or the senator. The staff knows what the representative, what the senator is looking for. They know the values that they have for this office, and so they can make a decision. They can often make a decision, not always, but they can often make a decision about whether or not the representative or senator wants to support this piece of legislation. So when you meet with a staffer, be respectful, be excited, tell your story, and be convincing. What an amazing opportunity. Number 8, develop a champion. So this is a strategy I think that's really beneficial for a long-term campaign. And so this idea of developing a champion. So you often want to find an elected official who is either the official for your district or is on a committee that's topically relevant to your legislative agenda. So perhaps this is something about increasing funding for respite for caregivers of adults with developmental disabilities. You want to find someone who perhaps has a family member with developmental disabilities or has previously cared about this, and really build your relationship with them. So you want to build a relationship with this elected official. And what this looks like, it means meeting with them, inviting them to your agency, educating them on the topic. Other good strategies include inviting them to talk at functions or events or giving them an award. You can make up the award, but giving them an award gives them the recognition that they're an expert and they are your champion on this issue. This takes time, but it really can be worth it in the long run, especially when we think about, as I mentioned earlier, the licensure bill that we passed last year. It took 10 years to get there, right? Developing a champion is a great way to do this. Number 9, be a resource. It is okay if you don't know something when you're meeting with an elected official. I feel like I learned this early in my social work education. It's okay to say, I don't know. Say you will find the information and get back to them. Then go and find the information and get back to them. That follow-up is really key. Be a resource for the staff member or the elected official. Again, you are the expert here. This gives an opportunity for a second meeting and another connection. The more information that you're able to consistently provide for an elected official, the better. Number 9, be a resource. Number 10, say thank you in person and in public. After you meet with an elected official or their staff member, write a card, write an email, say thank you, and continue to advocate. Do what your mother told you and express your gratitude. It's important to give yourself, your agency, and your elected official publicity when you meet. I know this sounds cheesy, but it's an important key to facilitating an ongoing relationship with your elected official. So those are my top 10 strategies. And I want to pause here and take some time for some more questions before our next section, which is looking at 5 steps for getting involved.
Laura Ellen, Ronald asks, can my legislator influence the committee that he is not on?
So I think this depends. So if your elected official or the elected official that you're talking to is in a place of leadership, so I'll give an example here. So I was meeting, as I said, I went to Millersville. So the representative that was my representative when I lived in Lancaster County is now the second ranking Republican in the House of Representatives. And so last year when our licensure bill was just sitting in committee and kind of stalling, I reached out to him because he was in a leadership position, and I said, this is really important. This is really important to protect the people of Pennsylvania, and explained, all the things of why we wanted this piece of legislation. And I said, can you use your influence to prompt the committee chair to call a vote on this bill? Like our bill last year was a very bipartisan bill. It didn't cost anything. So that was beneficial as well. And so, if you have connections, and I think this is really about building a champion, but especially if you have connections and if your legislator is in a place of power, either within their party or within the chamber, so the House or the Senate, I think that's a really great way to influence committee members, but especially that committee chair, because the committee chair is the one who decides whether or not a vote is called for, for that piece of legislation.
How important are emails to my legislator?
So I can go many ways on emails, and I have certain feelings. So I know organizations, and I haven't seen any recently. Maybe it's because I've just been so down on them. I don't like form emails or form letters. I don't think they do anything. I think they just go in a pile and go directly in the trash. So I think what is more important, I think they can be helpful, but I think they're helpful if you have an existing relationship with your legislator. So as an example, if you go and meet with your legislator in their office, whether it's in the Capitol or in their district, and then as a follow-up, I think, cards, just like the stock kind of cards, they're smaller than like a business letter, and so they kind of stick out a little bit. So I like to send paper cards, but I also think following up with an email is completely appropriate. And so if you have that ongoing relationship, certainly I think email is a fine way, but I think if an elected official is getting emails from like random people that they don't know, I don't think that email will be a top priority. So there are other ways, by calling, I think is an easier way to get to your elected official or a staff member to talk about a specific issue.
So the one question, was personal email. So a personal email, would it be more appropriate than just like an email blast?
Yes, yeah. I mean, email blasts, I don't think they're effective at all. I think it is better to, first of all, I think phone calls, should be prioritized over any kind of email, but I think a phone call and then following up with an email saying, I called your office and left this message. I'm following up on that. Here, is additional information. But definitely I would strongly encourage you to avoid any form emails. But if you're going to send an email, make sure that, it's in your own, it's written in the way that you talk. But yeah, so that would be those are my thoughts. And I know other people would probably disagree with me, but that's where I stand on it. Do we have other questions?
Nope, that's it for now.
All right, so we're going to spend our last little bit of time together here with 5 steps to get involved. And this is really, I think the top 10 tips are really helpful, but for me, thinking about these 5 steps are a great way to kind of push yourself to get started. So let's get started. All right, find a topic that you care about. Social work covers many, many things, right? I worked in critical care research, which is very different from my friends who work in labor or my friends who work in mental health or crisis management or, whatever that may be. So find a topic that you care about. And this really does seem like common sense. And so don't make it harder than it has to be. So maybe for you, you work in a mental health outpatient treatment facility as your full-time job. And while that's important to you, you don't know that you could spend your extra time thinking more about what you do day in and day out. And so it's okay to pick something else. But what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to speak knowledgeably about this topic and be passionate. Don't settle for something that you don't actually care about just because you think, other people will think this idea is interesting or this topic is interesting. So number 1, I would say pick a topic that you care about. Number 2, look for groups who are already advocating. There are so many organizations. I mean, these pictures just came from, a quick Google search or these logos, but find one that an organization that is related to your topic. Oftentimes, these are national organizations. Sometimes they will have state level or local level chapters. They've already done a lot of the foundational work in this area, oftentimes. And so these groups are always looking for volunteers and community partners. And this is what you want to do. So I would highly encourage you to reach out to an organization that aligns with the topic that you care about. Sometimes this isn't the case, and that's okay. But oftentimes there already is an organization that's doing something similar to what you're interested in. Okay, plan an advocacy strategy. So whether you're working by yourself or with a group or with an organization, you want to create a plan. So here are a list of tips that can help organize your thinking in developing a plan. So identify the policy needs. So again, if you're interested in, developmental disability, like the example I said, I mentioned earlier, maybe there's something that you really see a need, or you think that there's a need to increase funding for respite care for caregivers of folks with developmental disabilities, and understand that issue, right? So do your homework. Google is a great resource, but I would really look for organizations that are reputable that can really provide that information, and then identify the solution. So I think this is a big thing also. You don't want to go to your elected official and be like, well, this is the problem I have, and then they could ask, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? And they're like, and then you say, oh, well, I'm not sure. Have a solution. Say, oh, well, what I think we need is X, Y, and Z. And then think about an intervention in policy development, right? And then look for resources. What are the resources that are available? Look for allies. So maybe there are other organizations or lobbying groups, or maybe there are other elected officials that you want to bring in, and it's not just the elected official that represents your district. And then identify the change agents. And so I think this is something where this really aligns with this idea of developing a champion. But who are the people who are going to be those key levers, who are going to be able to pull those key levers to help make a difference? People who are in leadership positions, people who are well liked by their colleagues. That really goes a long way. And then think about some strategies and action items and make a plan. Say, okay, first I'm going to meet with Representative so-and-so, and then I'm going to meet with Senator so-and-so, and we're going to talk with them about these issues, and we're going to ask them to reach out to colleagues or who are other people that they think that might be instrumental in helping us to move forward. And then think about the context. Remember, this goes back to thinking about our person and environment. Is it budget season? If it's budget season, you may be able to have some meetings, but every elected official and every staff member is going to tell you, well, you're right, I think this is really important, but honestly, we can't do anything about it until the budget is passed. And that's the reality. They can't do anything about that. And, you may feel disgruntled and say, okay, well, you should, take on the system. But the reality is, the state has to pass the budget, and that's where we are. So really think about the context. Are there other things happening within the policy environment, within the political environment that would, hinder your ability to really advocate in this way? And then create an action plan. So this is really bringing your group of people together. Remember, social workers have this ability to bring a diverse group of people together. So bring folks together, create an action plan, assign people to each step, and then you're able to move forward. And then guess what? You get to put your plan into action. So advocate. So meet with your elected officials. Have, a lobby day, hold a rally, in the Capitol building or in a public space in your town. Write letters to the editor. Whatever is outlined in your action plan, put it into action and advocate and lobby for, either the topic or the piece of legislation that you're passionate about. Never give up. And I know, this feels very kind of cliche. This is hard work, and this is time-consuming work. This is emotionally draining work. And that's not to say that the work that you do as a social worker isn't more emotionally draining and more time-consuming. It certainly is. This process is really difficult, and people with a lot of money and resources are also vying for legislators' time and energy. And so don't give up. Like I've mentioned a couple times, it took 10 years for us to pass our licensure bill, and that is frustrating, and it shouldn't have taken 10 years, but it took us 10 years. And, it's one of those things you just have to keep going. And if you really, and this goes back to thinking about a topic that you care about. If you don't truly care, if you're not truly passionate about this topic, you can really become disillusioned by, what's happening and how hard and how frustrating this is. So never give up. You can do this. We can all do this. And I think that's really important. Okay, so that brings me to the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to flip to the next slide because this is my contact information. Please feel free to email me if you have any additional questions, or if you want to set up a phone call, I'm happy to do that. You can also follow me on Twitter. I talk about politics and social work and research and soccer. So if any of that interests you, feel free to give me a follow. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions with, the 8 or so minutes that we have left. Yeah, so that's all I have.
Laura Ellen, what are some common questions that legislators ask whenever we talk to them about something that we're passionate about?
So I think it depends on if we're thinking more broadly about educating broadly about a topic, or if we're talking about a piece of legislation. So I'll go through both of those. So when we think about a piece of legislation, oftentimes legislators want to know, how much is this going to cost, especially here in Pennsylvania. There is a majority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate. And so often, they want to know, well, how is this going to get paid for? So how much is it going to cost is a big thing. Who are the co-sponsors on the bill? And so I didn't talk a lot about that, but the sponsor of the bill is the person whose name is, at the top of the bill, and then other, legislators can sign on. And so, that's something else that I would encourage you, if you're looking at a piece of legislation or you're preparing a piece of legislation, think strategically about who is on, who are the sponsors on the bill. So if a bill is supported by all Democrats, chances are here in Pennsylvania that bill is not going to go anywhere because we have a majority of Republicans. If it is a bipartisan bill, I think there is much more chance of that bill moving, but also like, who are those figures? Are they in leadership positions? Are they chairs of committees? What does that look like? And does the leadership care about that topic? I think when you're educating broadly about an issue, and I think for most human services issue, or topics that we think about in social services, I think most of the time, and this has been in my experience with both Democrats and Republicans, most of the time people are, just don't know, and it's not that they're intentionally ignorant and are against a specific topic, but I think, again, their time is consumed by so many things. So when you think about legislators, especially at the state level, not only are they thinking about social services, but they're thinking about energy, they're thinking about infrastructure, they're thinking about, all the topics, like everything that you could possibly think of, they have to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that's really where being that resource and going and saying, hey, my name is Laura Ellen, I really care about how, primary care providers are able to have access to, evidence-based chronic pain management, and then talk about that, and then say, if you ever need me, here's my information, and then following up on a regular basis and saying, oh, this, new study came out, or, and that takes a lot of work on our end. But what I think is that, when the time comes, when there's a piece of legislation that's about the topic that you and this legislator have talked about, they'll remember and they'll reach out to you, especially if you've been kind of continually reaching out to them and providing them with ongoing information. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah.
Thanks. Glenn shared that PCN is a good resource about what's going on in Harrisburg legislative world.
Yeah, and I would also say you can go on to the Pennsylvania legislature website and sign up for, I think you can sign up for either daily or weekly updates about pieces of legislation. So you can subscribe to either a specific piece of legislation or any legislation that contains like a key word or updates from specific committees. And so I have a subscription set up that every day I receive emails, updates about everything that happened in the last 24 hours from like the Health and Human Services Committee, the Appropriations Committee, which the Appropriations Committee decides where the money goes, so they're really important. And then I also receive a email with the scheduled hearings for the committees. And so, for the Health and Human Services Committee, today they're planning on having hearings on these pieces of legislation. And if there's a piece of legislation that I'm interested in, I can follow up with folks and say, hey, I know you're on this committee. This piece of, legislation is coming up today, and you're having a hearing on it. Just to let you know, these are some things I think you should think about or consider for questions and things like that. Yeah, so there's all of that to say there are a lot of resources out there that can help you keep track of legislation.
And then Ronald asked, do you have any suggestions on what I can do about the effort to void the ACA? This is something I feel strongly about.
Yes, I also feel strongly about that. So, I think this is an excellent example of administrative policy and judicial policy, which we didn't talk about today. So to catch everyone up, and I haven't done a ton of reading on this, but the Trump administration has essentially said that they will not be using any of their resources through the Justice Department to defend any court action against the Affordable Care Act. And so what that means is when cases are brought up in court to challenge the validity of certain aspects of the Affordable Care Act, historically, as an example, the Obama administration would use their resources to fight those court cases. And the Trump administration has said that they're not going to use any of their resources to fight those court cases, which are incredibly expensive. I'm not sure what actions there are to take about that, other than, like if ACLU or some other nonprofits will decide to fight those court cases and fund, so you could certainly make donations to them. But, as is this example, your congressman or senator can't really do anything about this because this is something that is coming from the administration. And I think just, again, looking at the context, this administration has not been responsive to pressure from Republicans or Democrats. So that seems very bleak and dreary. And this is something that, I'm keeping an eye on, but I'm not sure that there's that much we can do, again, unless, ACLU or some of these other organizations decide to fight these things. But also, I don't know how they would do that because the court case would be against the federal government and not against like ACLU or something. Yeah. So that's a depressing outlook.
Yeah, we're at our time. It's 1 o'clock. Laura Ellen, just thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate you offering your time to do this for us. It was very informative for me, actually. And I just want to remind everyone that they will need to fill out the evaluation in order to receive the 1CE. I put it in the chat, but I'll also be emailing it to everyone as well. I hope you all have a great day, and thanks again, Laura Ellen.
Yes, thank you, and please reach out if you need anything at all. I'm happy to be in contact with folks. So thank you.